So thank you all for coming. This is our last evidence for Easter out of 3 sessions. If you don't know who I am, kind of have to go through this every time just in case there's like one person who hasn't come here or not listened to the previous recording. My name is Sam. I am 25 years old. I graduated from LST and in a BA in theology, and I'm currently a research student in church history. And about 5-6 years ago, I was an atheist agnostic, where essentially I scoffed at any idea of the supernatural. And after the Lord certainly turned my worldview upside down in a 180, I've grown an absolute love for apologetics. To do an apology, to do apologetics, is to give a reason, a defense for what you believe, not necessarily saying sorry for your faith, not being of a timid attitude, but being of a strong, quiet, reasoned attitude in a defense of your faith. This ultimately, the purpose of this evening is to really bolster our witnessing. We might connect with people a lot through the testimonies that we might share of how God has moved in our lives. I prayed for this and this happened. Or this person did a complete 180 in their life of sin and now they're living on fire for the Lord. That's all great until someone may say, well, that's all great, Sam, but I in fact know of a Muslim, I know of a Sikh, I know of a Hindu who actually, when they had a religious experience, they also turned their life into a kind of 180. So how do I exactly know that your conversion experience is true? Or another person's conversion experience is true? Or maybe aren't they all true and no religions are absolutely right? So that's where the idea of evidence comes in, where we're going to connect with people and we're going to be bolstering our witnessing through actually looking at experience, not necessarily aside, but putting evidence and rationality to the forefront. What can we actually prove about the faith's veracity, about its rationality? For those who want evidence, is there any evidence? Or have we all been told, or do we all believe what we've been told in talk shows, RE lectures, where there's nothing really about evidence in faith. It's all just about blind faith. Faith is apart from reason. And ultimately, we don't want that mindset. God gave us minds, and we're to worship God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is a part of the greatest commandment. So it's using our whole person, minds included, to worship God and to serve him. What we've done throughout this series is a cumulative case using 3 steps. First, we have established, did Jesus exist as a historical person? Regardless of what you may think of him, we may look at the evidence and see this person actually existed in history. Regardless of what you may think of him. And then after we've established that, we asked the question last week, can we actually trust the New Testament? Can we trust those accounts that tell of Jesus' life, that tell of the life of early Christians? Can we trust the manuscripts? Can we trust that the message that they wrote down is actually the message that we have today, or has it been corrupted? And then on the basis of that, laying the foundation of did Jesus exist as a historical person, and is the New Testament and what it says about him reliable, we can then get to the next stage. Did he actually rise from the dead as he said he would? I am going to be using 2 main scholars, but there's a lot more sources that I have used over the years to really meditate upon the evidence for Easter, the evidence for the resurrection, actually looking at what's the historical data that we have and what's the best explanation for the growth of Christianity. That's one of the main things that we've got to comprehend here tonight or meditate upon. What's the best reason for how Christianity came about? I'm going to be using Lee Strobel. The Case for Easter is a shortened account of otherwise his Case for Christ. It's something like kind of like a little tract to give out. It's really good in giving a concise view in the history for the resurrection, the evidence for it. Lee Strobel was an atheist journalist who actually converted to Christianity after trying to disprove it. So his testimony is very powerful in that regard. And also I'm going to be drawing from the resources of who I would say is probably the world expert at the moment in terms of Jesus' resurrection scholarship. And that is Dr. Gary Habermas of Liberty University. He's a professor of apologetics and philosophy. And he recently released this January a 1,000-page book on evidence for the resurrection, and that was only volume 1. He's done a lifetime of research into this, and he's finally compiling it into a magnum opus, probably before he retires, because he's done so much. You can catch his lectures on YouTube, but also he's released so many books about the evidence for the resurrection. He's dedicated his life to it and answering objections to the Christian hypothesis of what happened at 30 AD. But why is the resurrection of Jesus even important? Like, maybe we'd get some Christians today who'd be like, maybe we can just put the resurrection to the side, because it kind of causes people to cringe a bit. A miracle in today's enlightened age? Oh, I don't think we can handle that, Sam. This is the age of science, right? So someone might say, the resurrection doesn't really impact Christianity, does it? I mean, you just live as a good person, right? That's all that Christianity wants us to be. And the problem with that is that we're going against the words of St. Paul. What does Paul say? If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain, and we are found to be misrepresenting God. He goes on even further. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people to be pitied. So the question is, do you disagree with St. Paul? I'd say he's pretty knowledgeable on his Christianity. And so if he's saying that there's no resurrection, there's no Christianity, I would take him pretty seriously. A brilliant quote by Charles Spurgeon: the resurrection of our divine Lord from the dead is the cornerstone of Christian doctrine. So much about the growth of Christianity, its foundations, the idea of forgiveness, the idea of Christ triumphing over death itself to give us hope, rests upon this event. But you see, that's all well and good, but, is Jesus just one way to heaven? Like, maybe we could say he rose, but what about all of the other religions out there? Surely they can't all be wrong, right? And we have to contrast this again with the words of Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. So us Christians can't necessarily hold to the view that all religions are equally true. Ultimately, the standard of which we evaluate other religions and their claims comes from Jesus himself. That is the Christian toolbox. That is the methodology. C.S. Lewis as well said, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can even fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. If you speak to people on the street and say, what's your opinion about Jesus? They may say, oh, well, he was a great moral teacher, wasn't he? But the problem is that Jesus didn't claim just to be a moral teacher. The early Christians did not die just for a good moral teacher to live a good life in this age. They died and they believed in someone who they claimed rose from the dead and gave them the victory over death to give them hope before God that their sins will be forgiven. And even if there may be more subtleties, what if it was just a spiritual resurrection and he came back as a spirit? Some people even today subconsciously might hold this. In fact, modern day Jehovah's Witnesses, very, very strangely, believe that he only came back as a spirit and that it's not a bodily resurrection that Jesus went through, which is very peculiar. But the problem is that Jesus, again, does not leave a spiritual resurrection open to us. When he's driving out the money changers in the temple, what does he say? Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" And then here John adds, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. That does not necessarily leave us room to say it was a mere spiritual resurrection. Jesus' own words attest to that. So we're going to be covering what is the case for the resurrection, and maybe what other alternative theories there are, and do they have more explanatory power than the resurrection that Christians claim? And we're going to be answering objections using these other theories as well. And so this is ultimately to address the objection which many people may have, which is, isn't Christianity just wishful thinking? You know, it's a good place in worship. It's a good worship posture to be, is this all too good to be true? And there's two ways that you can handle that quote. You can say, you know what, it is too good to be true. I'm going to walk away from the faith. Or you can say, this is too good to be true. Yes, it is so extravagant, the love of God that he has for me, that this is how he did it. So you can either use it for worship or you can use it for skepticism. It's about your posture towards that. Did Jesus exist? We have 20 independent sources, both Christian, non-Christian, using the New Testament and sources outside of the New Testament, and we have a consensus among modern historians today, he existed as a person. The evidence does not leave room to say that he was a mere myth. We ultimately did that to build that foundation, and for any hyper-skeptics, which you might meet in your family or in the street, that's ultimately to go against them. And then, can we trust the New Testament? We have around 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament to compare, to whittle out in our investigations any mistakes that scribes might make in terms of copying, misspellings, missing out sentences, and so forth. That's what we looked at last week. And we have determined, even from the lips of atheist agnostic scholars, it is the best attested document of antiquity. And indeed, we have gone even further into it and say we can actually find pieces of the New Testament itself which are sourced from eyewitness data or witness data extremely close to the time of Jesus, to where we would be gasping for many historical events to be this close in proximity and this close in our earliest manuscripts. And something also which I want to establish before is we live in a very strange age today. I don't think anybody needs to really be convinced of that. But ultimately, if we think about let's just say the common person in the street, let's say, and they're not necessarily thinking about religion a lot, and so they actually have, through the decades of postmodernity in the 50s and 60s, this concept which has been filtered through books and media. I found myself believing this before I was a Christian. The idea of how can we actually get to the truth of the matter? How can we get to truth as it actually is? Like, surely we're just so biased and we're just so fallible all the time and opinions keep changing. How can we get to truth at all? And so sometimes what you will encounter if you're meeting people in the street, in the cafe, at a family dinner, is this kind of view, which is that all of the religions of the world kind of touch upon reality as it truly is, but none of them fully encapsulate it. They might say, oh, that Christianity, that's nice for you. Look, it has a little bit of truth in it which corresponds to true reality, but it's the same with Hinduism, Judaism, Islam. I think all religions have truth in them, and, aren't they all basically the same? And the Christian claim, or at least some might say also, it's arrogant to say that your religion is the only correct one. How can we do this in a non-arrogant way? Well, we do it through the Christian method, which is that we recognize that true reality corresponds to Christianity. And actually, some religions are closer to the truth of Christianity than others, but not in their totality. So the idea that the majority of our Bible is the Jewish Bible. So Judaism has a lot in common and correspondence with Christianity up until the point where they say Jesus is not the Messiah and the other references to his teachings. We might also say the same with Islam. Islam claimed to be an Abrahamic religion. They share a lot of similarities with Old Testament Judaism, but they start diverging from the Christian standard when they say that it is an unforgivable sin to say that God has a son. And ultimately, this appeal to arrogance, there are certain things which we can know for sure that aren't necessarily arrogant. We think of mathematics, for example. Is it arrogant to say that the only answer to 2 + 2 = 4? That's an interesting question. Surely if I want to be inclusive to all of the other worldviews out there, then I need to seriously take 2 + 2 = 5, 2 + 2 = 4. Maybe that's true, I don't know. Or, Sam, you're so arrogant, haven't you looked at all of the numbers out there? There are so many numbers out there. How can you say that 2 + 2 only equals 4? And I'll say, humbly, hopefully not in a firebrand way to put them off, but that I humbly believe that the only answer to 2 + 2 is 4. So there are certain truths which we can grasp, which actually discount other worldviews which may come our way. Another thing that will come up in your witnessing, it's very important to establish before we get to the evidence for the resurrection, is this genuine gesture, which I've heard probably countless times as well from my non-believing family and from non-believers which I have encountered. For any issue which you might raise in the faith, any moral problem, or any truth about Christianity or another religion, they might say, after the conversation, after you had a good go at it, well, I guess maybe we'll never know the answer, shall we? Maybe there's no objective right and wrong. Us humans probably aren't clever enough to figure it out. Maybe, but I guess we'll never know, shall we? And the problem is that I often find that people say this when the status quo agrees with them. Unfortunately, it is the case where you're talking with someone about religion and they're not really interested because they know that if Christianity is true, my life is going to have to change. I'm going to have to reorient my affections towards other things, towards material things, and move them more towards God. So it's very convenient to say, I guess we'll never figure it out, shall we? And we can even, I maybe would advise, if you know this person well enough, to actually start getting political. I know, the cardinal sin of English courtesy, you don't talk about religion and politics. We've already talked about religion, and now I say, get to politics. You don't think that there's an objective right and wrong? You think that we should just throw our hands up at these moral dilemmas? What about when all of a sudden our opposing political party starts getting more power in the state? What if the Tories get in, or Labour gets in, or UKIP gains a few seats, or something like that? Is anybody from that position going to go, I guess we'll never know the answer, shall we? Maybe there's no objective right and wrong. No, they're going to be like, you are wrong, here's why, I have access to moral truth as it is. So that's an interesting presupposition which they're hearing. You see, when the status quo doesn't agree with you, you're less likely to throw your hands up and say, I guess we'll never know to the bottom of it after all, shall we? So if the resurrection is true, everything changes. How we interact with other worldviews, how we interact with other religions. If the resurrection is true, the core tenets of Islam is false. Islam believes that Christ was not even crucified, that it was a mirage, that Judas replaced Jesus on the cross. And also Hinduism, in terms of the valid ideas or the validity of other gods that you can worship. Christianity says no, there is one. So let's do a recap of the resurrection account as we have it from the four Gospels. So Jesus is with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, taken and brought before the Jewish authorities to answer charges of blasphemy and of insurrection. He's brought before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and the Jewish authorities are very keen to say he is trying to overthrow Caesar. Pontius Pilate then finds that Jesus is doing nothing of the sort. He's preaching a heavenly kingdom. But ultimately, Pilate gives in to the crowds, and as a good politician, he starts appeasing the crowds. And ultimately, he is delivered over to be crucified. He is whipped and lashed with a flagellum. We'll get onto that later. That will get pretty gory. I'm going to give you a parental warning up there. And ultimately, Simon of Cyrene is chosen to help Jesus bear his cross, a random walker in the street, because Jesus is so weak from getting whipped to the bone that he needs someone else to carry his cross. And ultimately, Jesus is crucified and dies. His side is pierced by a Roman soldier to check that he is dead. And then Joseph of Arimathea gives Jesus his tomb in a garden, and that is accompanied by several women who are at Jesus' side throughout his ministry. And then, all of a sudden, come the morning of Easter Sunday, the tomb is left wide open when previously it was shut with a wax seal and set forth by a Roman guard, and they were all left frozen in fear. And many had experiences with the risen Jesus after this, at around, I think, a 40-day period before he then ascends. What evidence can we actually bring to actually make the resurrection a plausible account? This is one case to do. We're going to do many cases. This is one branch that we can go down to, because there are so many, and I'll keep you here all night if I have to, if I went through all of them, sorry. And so first we're going to look at the first epistle to the Corinthians, and we're like, okay, that's a strange place to start. But actually, when we see the great contention that this epistle has in the realm of apologetics and dialogue, we're actually going to see, wow, that's quite solid. We look at 1 Corinthians, written plus or minus in around the mid-50s AD. So this is around maybe 20-ish years, roughly after Jesus died and was resurrected. And it contains an early Christian creed, and this is very important. So why is it relevant? Because of this passage. I'm going to read it all, just so that way we can get familiar with it. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. He then appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. He then appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. He then appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the very least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. This is Paul's preface towards those in the Corinthian community that are doubting whether there is a general resurrection at all. And Paul is appealing to the resurrection of Jesus to say, you don't think that there's going to be a general resurrection of everybody? Jesus confirms that there will be a general resurrection because he himself was resurrected. And we look at what Paul appeals to, that Jesus, in fact, appeared to Cephas, also called Peter, then to the 12 apostles, 500 brothers, then to James, his brother, all the apostles, and then also to Paul. Here, Paul mentions around 6 witnesses. And so if you want to count up the numbers, around maybe 520. But either way, in that period in between the resurrection and the ascension, and Paul is saying, Paul is appealing to an early account of history. And it's important, this very first sentence. This is what the scholars get into. But this very first sentence, I delivered to you as of first importance what also I received. You see, for I delivered to you, this is Paul's first visit to Corinth at around 51 AD. So we're already establishing some historical background. Then we look at what I also received. We see that Paul, in his epistle to the Galatians, mentions this part of his history, which is roughly around in the 30s, which is what I also received, in terms of he is confirming the gospel message with Peter, James, and another apostle as well, I believe, in Galatians. And then these 2 key words as well are extremely important. This is when you get really down to the nitty-gritty, but I believe you guys can handle this, is these are in fact rabbinic terms for the passing down of tradition. So Paul didn't make this up in the 50s when he was appealing to the Corinthians. He was delivered, paradoka, and also paralabon, received. These are rabbinic terms for tradition being passed on to him, which we can see is the early account of Galatians in the mid-30s. This is extremely close to when Jesus died and resurrected, either in 30 AD or 33. There's debate on that. But ultimately, what do you know, Sam? This is me when I was baby-faced, clean-shaven, so I haven't updated the picture. But what exactly do I know? Okay, I made this before I even had a theology degree. What do I know? The thing is that this is not something which you get on the fringe parts of the internet. This is not something that you get in maybe one book in a collection of all of the other books. This is attested by top-of-the-class commentaries and scholarship. So John Meyer, N.T. Wright, Habermas, Mike Licona, Richard Borkham, James Dunn, many others as well that I could litter the screen with to go, these are top-of-the-line Christian scholars who say, we have a solid account. The evidence is enough to be believed that the resurrection is the most plausible case. And then maybe somebody who would object to you would say, oh, very good, Sam, but, I mean, they're Christians, right? So surely they would believe in the resurrection. So maybe the evidence isn't that good, but their faith means that they're going to overlook that shallow evidence and then come to the conclusion anyway. The problem with that is that it can work both ways, okay? Christianity being true is not a position that you can be neutral in. It's not necessarily something that a disinterested person can examine. Okay? You don't get atheist scholars saying, I believe the resurrection existed, or the resurrection happened, because then they'd become Christians. So we can't really, except maybe one wacko, believe in the resurrection and then not follow through with what that means for their life. So the attribution of bias, unfortunately, it doesn't work both ways. That's something incredibly important when you might bring certain pieces of scholarship to a skeptical person. And if we want to go for skeptical scholarship as well, John Dominic Crossan, he is no friend of Christianity. He even says this about the section in Corinthians that we just cited. Paul wrote to the Corinthians from Ephesus in the early 50s CE. But he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3, I handed on to you as of first importance, which I in turn received. The most likely source and time for his reception of that tradition would have been in Jerusalem in the early 30s. when, according to Galatians 1:18, he went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. So this is something even attested to by an atheist scholar who has made quite a lot of his popularity on leaving Christianity, elevating himself to the top parts of scholarship and then writing books against Christianity. And there are ultimately other creeds found in the New Testament. This is not necessarily something which is foreign. These are also codified creeds. In 1 Corinthians, we have the preaching in Acts. We have the received traditions that Paul attests to in the book of Romans and in Philippians as well. There's a debate on whether that was the Christ hymn or a creed. And ultimately as well, the Lord's Supper. It's very close language to what we find in the Gospels. It shows that there was early recitation, an early recitation of a particular creed. And so this can be dated within several years after the cross. And quite frankly, this is historical gold. This is not something which is a tunnel period where there's a giant grey space for hundreds of years when anything could have happened and melded in the story of Jesus, and then people started claiming that he rose from the dead. This is within the first few years of the sources that we have. Okay? So this is incredibly, incredibly early. So again, early 30s, Christian message is spreading. Then we have Paul's conversion. He did a trip in Arabia, and then Paul's receiving of a tradition. That's within the space of a few years. But ultimately, what scholar in their right mind would say that Christians saw Jesus being risen anyway? Right? So it may be early, Sam, but what scholar in their right mind would even say that Jesus appeared to people? And here's where I'd say I'm going to bring up 3 skeptical scholars for you, where you can have the atheist position and still say that there were resurrection appearances. This is how. E.P. Sanders, first of all, he's a skeptical scholar. We may add a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. His disciples at first fled. They saw him, in what sense is not certain, after his death, and as a consequence they believed that he would return to found the kingdom. They formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. So the way that you would maybe get past this early attestation of appearances of Jesus is to say, we're not exactly certain what happened in terms of like what caused them to have appearances of Jesus. As a Christian, I think the answer is fairly obvious. But, of course, there are other options as well. Not probable options, but possible options nonetheless. We can also go to Bart Ehrman. He's also been frequently cited throughout this series, both as a friend and a foe in a sense. Again, no friend of Christianity. What does he say? Why then did the disciples claim to see Jesus alive after his crucifixion? I don't doubt at all that some of the disciples claimed this. Paul, writing 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed, and I don't think he is making it up. And he knew at least a couple of them whom he met just 3 years after the event, talking about the event in Galatians. Another one, Gerd Ludemann. It may be taken as historical certainty that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So, eyewitnesses of Jesus after the resurrection? So this is what is found in 1 Corinthians 15 again. So it says Peter, the 12, the 500, James, the brother of Jesus, and then all of the other apostles as well, and then, as to one unlikely born, Paul. And this is extremely important, and this is also historical gold, because it is admitted that the account of the Acts is true in terms of Paul was once hostile to the faith. And also, these skeptical scholars would admit too, that James, the brother of the Lord, who was previously hostile towards Jesus being called Messiah, eventually became Christians. And we have to ask the question, if not the resurrection, then what caused these hostile voices to become Christians. Okay, maybe you could say the disciples were wishfully thinking Jesus to be alive again and being persecuted for that. That's pretty weird. But what do we do with the enemies of Christianity? What do we do? What changed their mind? What did they experience for them to change their mind so radically? We look at Paul before Christ. He was a zealous Pharisee, strict adherer of the law, none more righteous than he claims. And he imprisoned Christians, taught under Gamaliel, and he had a bright future. Okay? The Pharisees were a well-respected group in ancient Israel. He had a career going for him. He was pretty well off. So what caused him to sacrifice that life and take on a life of an itinerant preacher going from synagogue to synagogue trying to win Jews over to Christ, making tents in order to get by? Look at the road to Damascus, where ultimately Paul has an encounter with the risen Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And this radical experience is not really debated among the scholarship. People will say, oh, well, maybe Paul was, he was just crazy, or he was guilty, or he was schizophrenic, and therefore that's how he could have had an experience of the risen Jesus, but then it not actually being true. The problem is that, at least when it comes to schizophrenia, when we look at his other writings, when we actually examine what he writes, he doesn't exactly talk like a crazy person. He seems very coherent at times. And Paul, after Christ, from this lavish, highly esteemed, prospecting Pharisee, whipped 5 times, 40 lashes each. 3 times beaten with rods, 3 times shipwrecked, house arrest, brought before courts, and then ultimately, as attested in Clement in 90 AD, just before the destruction of the temple, beheaded for his faith around the 60s AD. So what caused Paul to change into that lifestyle? You don't change into that lifestyle just for the sake of it. Maybe there's one crazy guy out there who would love that, but I'm saying that that's probably not Paul. And this is not just true of Paul as well. We have other accounts of early Christians suffering for the faith. And the question is, these people who attested to see the risen Jesus, what would cause them to take on so much suffering, to take on so many trials, and to risk death? What would cause that? What is the best explanation for that? Peter, it is attested in John's Gospel, was crucified. Tradition says he was crucified upside down. That's why, contrary to Hollywood, the upside down cross is actually a good symbol. That is the cross of St. Peter. He believed that he was unworthy to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was crucified, so he said, "Turn me upside down." And then they obliged. Paul, as we can attest from a source outside of the New Testament as well, was beheaded. Both a Clement of Rome, a leader in Rome around the 90s AD, attests to both of them being martyred for their faith. And also we have various sufferings of the apostles. They didn't all necessarily die by martyrdom, at least the ones that we can historically verify. But ultimately they endured great suffering, and some of them did in fact die. We have early sources from roughly around the same time which attest to that. And then also we have James, the brother of Jesus, who is again attested as being martyred for being a Christian after being thrown off a tower by Josephus, and also Clement of Alexandria a little bit later. But Josephus is an incredibly early source for that. So the history definitely indicates that the early Christians were suffering, especially those who claimed to see the risen Jesus. Why would contemporaries of Jesus who witnessed his death give up everything and die for him? Why would they? What's the best explanation for this? See, liars make poor martyrs. That's a catchphrase which is floating around in apologetics and I think is very powerful. You're not necessarily going to die and suffer for a lie, are you? You're not necessarily going to be a part of the now 11 apostles in 30 AD. You're going to make up that this teacher that you were following around actually rose from the dead. I mean, you could make it up, but why would you stick in Jerusalem? All our sources say that they stuck in Jerusalem. Why wouldn't they go to other parts of the world to say, yeah, he rose in Jerusalem, nobody can verify us? Instead, they stuck around. They had debates with the Jews. And so, Pastor Sam, people are martyred all the time for various parts of their faith, okay? And this is true. All it shows is that they were sincere, but it doesn't prove the validity of their beliefs. You see, people today are martyred, but it just shows that they're sincere, not what they believe is true. You believe that there are Muslim martyrs, right? You believe that there are Hindu martyrs, right? Shinto martyrs, all dying for their religion. That doesn't mean that it's true. That is a technical truth, but I'm going to show you why it's different for this case. You see, we have the tenacity of North Korean, Iranian Christians who are being persecuted day on day, having their rights removed for their faith. They attest to an experience of the risen Jesus from 2,000 years, who lived 2,000 years ago. That is different from people who are contemporaries of Jesus who claimed to witness an historical event within their lifetime. You can see how that's different? So what other theories are there? Maybe I've provided a convincing enough case, but what if there are other cases out there that just make sense of the data more, and I don't necessarily have to believe in the resurrection for that? One of them is called the swoon theory. This became popular around about 200 years ago, and it quickly died off, but it was one way, especially which liberal Christians who didn't want to believe in a physical resurrection, who wanted to take most of Scripture symbolically to live a good life, but not necessarily to attest to Jesus as Lord. What if Jesus survived the cross? What if instead he was given a remedy in the so-called vinegar that he was given on a sponge? What if that was like an anesthetic or something? What if then he rose from the dead? It was all a giant kind of swooning conspiracy. There's a big problem with that. So again, is this more probable than a resurrection? The problem is that Lee Strobel actually interviews a person who has studied, medical degree, studied the wounds of the resurrection itself, or just the whole account, the wounds of Jesus himself, what he actually went through. This is where it gets gory. But he especially attests to the torture of a flagellum. The flagellum is what Jesus was whipped with, and this would have balls of steel to bruise the flesh, and also sharp objects with pieces of bone attached to some of the whips as well. This would actually probably kill a person outright if given enough time being whipped. Braided with leather thongs, sharp pieces of bone, metal pieces to bruise the skin. His injuries that he would have sustained, bruises, deep cuts, ribbons of flesh coming off, his back would basically be laid bare. There would probably be cases where all of the flesh would be removed, and he would be suffering absolutely terribly from the blood loss that this would have caused. Ultimately, with the crucifixion itself, if you were to use the word crucify in the ancient world, people would cringe. They would look at you as if why would you say that? Just to say that word, because they knew that was one of the worst ways that you could torture somebody. It was an incredibly slow death where you would asphyxiate yourself slowly, because the only way to breathe is to put pressure on your legs to lift up the chest so that way your lungs can take in the air. But the problem is that your feet are nailed shut so that you are pushing down on the wounds while you're doing that. And then, especially for some cases, the crows would be also wanting to have a go at your body, even if you're only half alive. It is absolutely terrible what he went through. And this is what Alexander Metherell says, who Lee Strobel interviewed. A person of that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his Gospels to go out and proclaim that he is the Lord of life who triumphed over the grave. After suffering that horrible abuse, with all the catastrophic blood loss and trauma, he would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have hailed him as the victorious conqueror of death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to health. You can imagine this image of just a mere anesthetic or something. And then all of a sudden, there's Jesus appearing in the room to the 11, dripping in blood, trembling at the knees, back laid bare. And you're thinking, okay, is he the victorious Son of God? Is this what the accounts say? No. This is what makes it even more of a miracle. It is confirmed, and even with the spear in his side. This is attested. This was to confirm that, in fact, he was dead. No anesthesia is going to get you out of these wounds alive. So Lee Strobel asks, so when someone suggests to you that Jesus was merely swooned on the cross, Metherell says, I tell them it's impossible, a fanciful theory without any possible basis in fact. So if you want to get past the idea of the resurrection, you can't necessarily use the swoon theory. What about a conspiracy theory? What if the disciples, in fact, stole Jesus' body? Nobody knew where the body was. Maybe the disciples stole it. The problem is that they don't necessarily, at least many people don't steal bodies for no reason whatsoever. Again, maybe there's one wacko out there, but I'm not sure about the 12 disciples. So what would actually motivate them to steal the body of their teacher that they claim would rise from the dead? Would they do it for money? You know? Would they do it in order to get their tithes or something like that? There's a big problem that we find with the New Testament data itself, is that they have teachings of Jesus recorded that they would have lived by, which shows aversion towards gaining riches. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So they're following a Jesus that taught this story. But what if they were stealing money, even though that they knew that Jesus was said stuff about aversion to riches? What if they were stealing it anyway? The problem is that it's more likely, if you were a grifter of Christianity, you'd want to create a theology which would allow for extravagant prosperity. Truly, the greatest Christians are those with the most money, because that's a sign that God has blessed them, right? Yet we find no early Christian teachings of this prosperity gospel. If they were so hungry for money of very poor, illiterate people in Judea, a very strange way of gaining money in the ancient world, it wouldn't get you that much profit. Why wouldn't you create doctrines to say, maybe you guys can sell, but the leaders, we get all of it? We find grifters today, normally on Christian television, along those lines, and we can see that they try and develop a theology in order to account for their mega millions and their private jets. But an honest reading of Scripture doesn't support that. So they weren't necessarily doing it for the money. Well, what if they were doing it for the fame? What if they didn't care about the money? What if they just they were just a group of 12 narcissists? What if they just really wanted to be seen as the apostles of the Lord? Behold, I'm a holy man, I'm a holy man. Problem with that is, what accounts did they actually preach and preserve? This is where we get into some incredibly important historical data. This is a rule of thumb which is especially used in history. It's called the criterion of embarrassment. It's this idea. If you're going to make up a story, you're less going to be likely to make up a story in which you are incredibly embarrassed. one that shows you as almost like a worthless follower of Jesus. Surely if you were fabricating a tale, you'd want to be like, and then Peter, he had faith to move mountains. He was the best disciple of all of the apostles, and he did all these wonderful things. Look how awesome he is. And he stuck with Jesus to the end. He stuck with Jesus to the end, even on the cross. And he said, "No, I die for my master." Well, what do we have? Embarrassment number one, an apostle betrays Jesus. So even among their ranks, there is an apostle that betrays the Lord himself, that allows for his death. Embarrassment two, the disciples abandon Jesus. If you were going to create a wonderful story about how brilliant the apostles are, why do we have them running away and Peter not even putting up a fair fight, cutting off the ear of a servant? He wouldn't go for like one of the armed guards or something. He just cut off the ear of a servant and ran away. Peter denies Jesus, the head of the apostles. The first among equals, he denies Jesus 3 times when he said that he would stick with Jesus to the end. Why would Peter make up a story like that? And the apostles were not even faithful after Jesus died. Maybe they were scared about the guards, but then maybe they came back to bury his body. No, a stranger buries Jesus. One of the Sanhedrin, a Jesus follower in secret, and also according to John's account, Nicodemus himself. The Pharisees, the main group that was against Jesus, some of their followers actually pitied Jesus and took him to be buried. And this is an incredibly key one. It's one of my favorite arguments for proving the resurrection account is reliable. And that is, who are the first witnesses of the resurrection? If you don't count the Roman guards who were paralyzed through fear, because they apparently didn't share much, we have the woman's testimony. A bunch of Marys appeared, all the same name. It was a very common name in the first century. But actually, the women stuck around with Jesus to the end. Through the crucifixion, they witnessed him be buried in the tomb. And they came back to embalm his body with various spices to keep it kind of fresh and not necessarily smell too bad on Easter morning. And so, what's the deal? I mean, what's the deal with women testifying to the risen Lord? First off, no joke, nobody, it's not a surprise to anybody. The first century was a very patriarchal age for pretty much any culture. And this is an incredibly important thing because it's women testifying, as the story goes, they went to the apostles. But you see, even in Jewish culture, Josephus, what does he say about Jewish law courts of testimony? But let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at least, and those of such testimony is confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul. So if these Jewish apostles wanted to fabricate a story, what if they were sincere and they just wanted the message of Jesus to get out? Why would they have women testifying to the apostles whose opinions aren't even allowed in a Jewish law court? And in fact, as the story goes, as the accounts show, the apostles didn't even believe them. It took a physical appearing of Jesus himself to convince them, versus merely accepting the opinion of the women, the testimony of the women who saw him. So if you're creating and fabricating a story, why would you leave that in? If you're fabricating it so that way other people in your circles would believe in Christianity, why would you include that? Why would you not at least have the men first appearing? This makes no sense of why it would be fabricated. Therefore, it makes more sense that it actually happened and that they're recording history. And again, why would you make up the story? The Christian life was one of hardship. We've seen before in the martyrdoms as well. So what if Jesus' body ended up missing? What if the apostles didn't steal it? But what if somebody else did? Or what if it just ended up missing? And this is, I think, a position by Bart Ehrman. But ultimately, we have in our record the Jews taken preventative measures to keep the body in the tomb. We have a Roman guard being set, and also we have witnesses to the burial. The idea, especially in the Gospels, is that if there is a name written down, at least in the early passing on to the tradition, you could verify it. It's what we had in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul said, some are still alive right now, though some have fallen asleep. The presupposition was, go ask them. And ultimately, there is a tale of a fake body being produced by the Jews, but ultimately that doesn't last, and apparently nobody believes them. And so the tale of the alternative body, or the body being produced by the authorities, it's not attested to much at all. It's not attested in the histories. It's not attested in enemies of Christianity as one of their arguments. So ultimately, I think nobody believed in this alternative corpse. You could bring up any corpse to the community and say, here is your dead Messiah. Just don't look at him too close. But yeah, this is a body. Just don't look at him too close. There's also, this is a brilliant one, the hallucination theory. This is probably one of the most suitable, common objections which you may have where, okay, Sam, I'll grant you that the disciples had resurrection appearances, but what if their appearances only in the mind, you know? I mean, someone might say to you, grief hallucinations are very common. Many people in this room may have had grief hallucinations themselves. They sense or hear the deceased person with them. Clearly, Jesus' disciples had hallucinations of him. They loved him so much, didn't they? So it would make sense that trauma would lead them all to hallucinate an image of him, and then they believed that as a resurrection. There's a problem with this. And this is quoted by Mike Licona in his very, very large book on the resurrection of Jesus. He is professor in, or he's PhD in professional psychology. So he's the man to go to, and this is what he says. I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journals, articles, and books, written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination. That is, an event in which more than one person purportedly shared in a vision or other sensory perception when there was clearly no external referent. This means that in the realm of psychology, in the realm of mind science, we have yet to find a single case of a group of people at one time hallucinating the same thing. And even then, even more bold, or even more damning to the hallucination theory, it was multisensory. Sometimes when you experience grief hallucinations, you might feel their presence in the room, or you might hear their voice, or you might glance at a movement in the curtains, and you could have sworn, that's my relative who was recently buried at the funeral. But very rarely are these multi-sensory. Touch is documented for. They were hearing him because they were speaking to him. They saw him, and this was done by multiple people. We do have accounts, like in Paul, of a single person seeing Jesus alone, but the earliest story that we have of the disciples themselves is multisensory with multiple people going on at the same time. Nobody in the room is asking the question, hold on, what are you guys seeing? Thomas is seen as the doubter, but the only reason why he was a doubter is because he was in a separate room entirely, not because he was in the same room looking at a different hallucination. And so ultimately, a multisensory, multi-personal hallucination being witnessed by hundreds of believers would be a miracle in itself. It is so unlike what the data that we have today in psychology that we ultimately have to ask, how much do you want to just stretch the facts so that way we can get past the resurrection? You want to believe in a hallucinatory experience that nobody has gone through before as far as we can document. Ultimately, there's something going on if you're starting to appeal to such a rare experience. And so we can conclude, along with many other strands, but just for the sake of time, I can't go into too much depth. But the case for the resurrection is solid. It can be made looking at the data that even skeptical scholars will admit, just using what they say and the ground that they admit. Quite frankly, I find it so refreshing to my soul when I see so many atheist scholars or non-believing scholars say, yes, we can admit that the early Christians had appearances of Jesus among them. And we look at the rest of the data that we have, and we can say, I think this is the best explanation of the data that we have. So, in conclusion, we have a historical man reported to exist by 20 independent sources. A document written about him, which is the best attested book in antiquity through manuscripts, and is also seen as historically reliable. He is reported to heal the sick and to do miracles. He predicted his own death and resurrection. He was crucified, dead, and buried. His followers reported to have seen him after his death, and this was seen as a sincere experience. They weren't making it up. These followers died bloody deaths and claiming that he indeed was the risen Lord. Skeptics converted after reporting seeing him, knowing that they would be killed for the faith. Opposing theories of the resurrection do not fit the data or science today. Millions of lives are changed back then and so today, and millions even today, especially in China, Iran, North Korea, many other places, suffer persecution for his name today due to the power of what they have experienced in him even today. Jesus is risen with all the consequences that come with that. So that's the thing. If someone believes in the resurrection, then essentially ask them, what do you do now? They might say, you know what, this was like the final hurdle to me becoming a Christian. I think I believe that the resurrection is the best explanation for the data. And so the question is, okay, what do you do now? Are you just going to sit there, throw your hands up and say, I don't know? You just admit it. It's the best explanation for the data. Now you have to make a choice. You see, the consequences of the resurrection is that there is a God who raised Jesus from the dead. That sin exists and has a costly element paid for by Jesus himself. That God has revealed his will to humanity, and God has enough faith in the human capacity to understand what God is saying. We don't necessarily go, God has revealed something, but we're so futile in our senses that we can't ever interpret it correctly. And Christianity is a lens through which everything becomes clear, to where even if you are averse to saying all religions apart from mine are wrong, you can say Christianity is the standard. And there are some religions that agree with Christianity more than others. The Jews are monotheists. Islam agrees that Jesus is a prophet and holds to other Old Testament prophets. But it's important that we have a cutoff line through the standard of Christianity. So it's really not an arrogant claim if you have it based in the data. And this is one of the more famous quotes by C.S. Lewis as well. I believe Christianity as I believe the sun is risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. This provides a brilliant clarity to the world. Answers for why is there suffering in the world? How can I become a better person? And is there actually a God that takes interest in what I do? And how should I live by that? If the resurrection is true, then you have a story in God's grand plan. There is nobody written out of the script. Everybody has their role in God's grand theatre. It means that we all have a life driven by that purpose. And we have a meaning, an objective meaning and value that is not based on our output of what we do, but it is in who we are. And it means that regardless of how we are feeling, what the resurrection claims is that we are loved objectively. And this is the same for our neighbor. This is the key thing about evidence for Easter. This is for our neighbor. This is for those who don't necessarily believe in Jesus yet. If the resurrection is true, this is a conviction to all of us. And it's definitely a conviction to me, which is if the resurrection is true, if Jesus actually rose from the dead and is approved by God, that affects how I live. So that is ultimately the Evidence for Easter series. Just want to thank you all for coming along. It's been a great encouragement to see so many people here. This has been an utter joy of mine. I want to do this for like a living if some job would take me. That's why I want to be a lecturer. It's like just bringing this to churches. I hope that we can all see through going throughout this series, even if we've gone to even one session, that there is a depth of treasure that God has given us, which we should really harness. It's encouraging to us, and it's encouraging to our evangelism efforts. The idea that, oh, well, somebody's asking for evidence, well, I guess I'll just pray for them and give them my testimony. If they're not convinced, then maybe that's just hard soil for now. Yes, but I think it's incredibly important for a lot of people in their journeys to faith, the work of the Spirit going throughout all of that, which is this religion probable? Is it the best explanation for what we have in our experiences today, and even in terms of the historical data that we have? And if you want to posit wild hallucination theories, that's fine. But you admit that it is a reasonable religion to follow. I think I'll stop there before I get too preachy. But again, thank you guys for coming. Thank you for sacrificing your night. Praise God.